England, winter of 1942. The thick smell of coal smoke fills your lungs. You are stuck in the cramped cab of a black steel monster. Behind you are not smooth passenger cars, but thousands of tons of artillery shells and explosives waiting to detonate. The train is hurtling down a slippery slope in the pitch black of a curfew night. The speed skyrockets. The acceleration crushes your chest. Driven by survival instinct, you frantically pull the brake lever with all your might. But a chilling slip answers back. The giant machine continues to barrel down the slope like an out-of-control mad beast. Right in that moment, when your pupils dilate in terror, a cruel truth strikes your mind. This monster, bearing the responsibility of saving an entire empire, is completely unequipped with a braking system strong enough to stop it. Your life, along with the trail of destruction dragging behind you, is no longer in your hands. It has been thrown into death's game of Russian roulette. And the most horrifying thing doesn't stop there. This tragic scenario is not a random technical failure or a flaw due to wear and tear. It is a death sentence signed off by a cold-blooded cutback right on the very design blueprints that the nation praises as genius. Welcome to the secret files of the Southern Railway Q1, the machine often mockingly referred to by history as the ugly duckling or the Frankenstein monster of the railway. For over 8 decades, textbooks, museums, and epic documentaries have brainwashed us with a highly heroic tale. They say that its boxy, crude shape, devoid of smooth curves, is the ultimate symbol of sacrifice. That this is an austerity design, born to save every ounce of steel to rescue England during World War II. People praise Chief Engineer Oliver Bulleid like a saint for creating a machine with unparalleled pulling power, yet 14 tons lighter than its contemporaries, allows it to freely navigate 97% of the aging railway network in southern England. But as seekers of truth, when we stop clapping and begin flipping through the yellowed maintenance records, those praises start to reek of an elaborate cover-up. The first concealed truth. That bizarre, boxy outer casing was absolutely not born to easily pass through automatic carriage washers, as the media reports of the time proclaimed. It was the consequence of a failed personal gamble. Engineer Bulleid stubbornly used Idaglass, a cheap, unproven fiberglass insulation material at the time. When this material revealed its weakness, turning mushy and unable to support the conventional curved boiler cladding, he was forced to firefight. Instead of starting over, Bulleid ordered the hasty construction of a box made of ultra-thin steel plates covering the entire machine to hide the collapsing mess inside. So what about the miraculous figure of being 14 tons lighter? It wasn't a miracle. It was a trade-off paid in blood. Those 14 missing tons didn't just come from stripping away excess details, but from ruthlessly thinning out the steel structure and, most importantly, slashing the braking system of the locomotive itself. In an era where trailing freight wagons had no brakes, the lives of the crew relied entirely on the locomotive. Yet, to hit a crazy weight target on paper, Bulleid equipped this giant with an extremely flimsy braking system, pushing crews into a game of Russian roulette on the tracks. Bulleid created the most powerful 060 freight locomotive in Britain, but stripped away the ability to control that power. Even the most humorous anecdotes about this machine are tinged with darkness. People often pass around the funny story that in its final years, crews had to close the regulator when entering stations so that ash wouldn't blow directly into passengers' faces. But in reality, it was a life-or-death alarm bell. The ultra-thin steel plates used to shed weight for the locomotive had been heated, rusted, and become porous, riddled with holes after just a period of operation. The machine was never perfect. It was decomposing and eroding itself from the inside even while rolling. In the next few minutes, we will not reread the hollow praises from encyclopedias. We will peel back every rusted steel layer of this coffee pot together to answer a haunting question. Was the SRQ-1 truly a masterpiece that saved the nation? Or just a mad laboratory, blatantly disregarding human life, perfectly disguised under the cloak of patriotism? Sit tight, because what you are about to watch will shake every belief you ever had about the golden age of steam trains. To understand why a machine carrying the seeds of disaster like the Q1 was hastily approved for production, we must step through the smoke of time, advancing deep into the stifling corridors of the Southern Railway (SR) leadership during the early years of the World War. Before the war, SR was like a leisurely urban gentleman. Their network primarily served passengers and commuters traveling around London and the southeast of England, using clean, smooth, electrified railways. They had never been a muscular giant in the heavy freight transport industry. But when gunshots rang out on the European continent, that gentleman was suddenly thrown straight onto the front lines. Directly facing the French coast, SR's railway system immediately became the sole vital umbilical cord to pump blood for the war machine. Tanks, artillery shells, and tens of thousands of soldiers had to be funneled to the southern seaports. The core issue causing panic here was not just a shortage of trains. The real crisis lay in the fact that SR's infrastructure was too fragile. Their aging bridges and tracks would collapse if they had to carry the colossal, heavy freight locomotives of rival companies on their backs. They were cornered into a seemingly unsolvable puzzle. They urgently needed to build a machine with the pulling power of an elephant, yet it had to have the light axle weight of a cat. And right in that moment of the nation's sheer desperation, Oliver Bulleid stepped onto the stage. History books often honor him as a savior hero, but from the perspective of an investigation, Bulleid appears more like a grand gambler and an outstanding opportunist. In peacetime, Bulleid was already notorious for his rebellious, bizarre, and extraordinarily expensive design philosophies. His experimental proposals were frequently swatted away by the board of directors because the risks were too high. But 1942 was completely different. War brought not only destruction, it also created a perfect blind spot for a lack of oversight. Under the pressure to immediately possess strategic locomotives to sustain the nation's lifeblood, all rigorous censorship protocols were torn to shreds. Bulleid seized upon the board of directors' panic, using a blank check named wartime state of emergency to turn this entire project into a giant personal laboratory. That was where he could secretly smuggle in technical fantasies that no one had enough time or sanity to stop. The most ridiculous proof of this spectacular hoax is the outer casing of the Q1 itself. Look back at the historical photos. Why does this machine have no running plate? Why is it boxy and dead flat like an iron biscuit tin? For decades, the propaganda machine has preached that it was a minimalist design, cutting out all curves to save metal, while also helping the machine easily pass through the automatic carriage washing system to save labor. It sounds so pragmatic and noble at first glance. But that was just a media charade to cover up the truth. When cross-referencing the original technical drawings, this fake facade crumbles. The root cause of that bizarre shape stemmed from a systemic error in the material selection phase. Bulleid was determined to test Idaglass, a type of fiberglass insulation for boilers. It was cheap and readily available, but he deliberately ignored one fact. This material was far too flimsy. It was mushy, load-bearing incapable, and lacked the strength to support a curved metal casing hugging the boiler like traditional locomotives. It would collapse. Instead of admitting he had chosen the wrong material and replacing it, Bulleid opted for a cover-up. He ordered the hasty construction of an outer jacket made of flimsy, wafer-thin steel sheets, boxing in the entire machine to hide the weak mess of fiberglass inside. The matchbox design was absolutely not a noble sacrifice for Britain. It was the way a stubborn engineer hid his own design failure. And the irony didn't stop there. If the SRQ-1 was truly an austerity machine, born to tighten belts for the military, then why was its core internal structure so incomprehensibly luxurious? People called the Q1 a symbol of destitution. But bend down and look at its wheel set. Instead of using traditional spoked wheels, a technology that was already ubiquitous, cheap, and easily mass-cast under conditions of scarcity, Bullard decided to equip the Q1 with solid cast disc wheels, Bullard Firth Brown. This was an extremely expensive technology, complex to manufacture, and heavily imbued with the style of continental European railways. Could it be that, under the smokescreen of finding every way to reduce weight, Bullard sneakily stuffed expensive technologies and personal experimental design ideas into a machine that should have only needed crude pragmatism? The more we peel back the grimy black paint of the SRQ-1, the clearer we see it as an entity of ultimate contradiction. Cloaked on the outside in the tattered rags of a wartime pauper, yet hiding within the luxurious shoes of a technical playboy. However, all those lies about design or materials would amount to nothing if we did not dig deep into another element. An element carefully hidden within the figure of reducing 14 tons of weight. The very thing that turned the Q1 from a technological gamble into a life-snatching death machine on steep tracks. Let's return to that 14-ton figure. For decades, encyclopedias have hailed the Q1 being 14 tons lighter than comparable locomotives as a miracle of belt-tightening engineering. But in physics, there are no miracles. There are only laws of trade-offs. You cannot simply vaporize 14 tons of steel from a giant freight machine just by removing a few running plates or using a fiberglass casing. That massive amount of weight had to be slashed from something far more core. And the thing sent to the guillotine, ironically, was the very lifeline of the train crews: the braking system. The chilling truth is that to achieve an impossible weight target on paper, Bullard callously whittled down and slashed the locomotive's own braking components to the absolute minimum. To understand the sheer madness of this decision, you need to know the specific nature of the British railway industry in the 1940s. At that time, the vast majority of freight trains were unfitted goods trains, meaning the dozens of fully loaded wagons trailing behind had absolutely no automatic braking system. The stopping power for an entire colossal train weighing thousands of tons and hurtling down a slope relied 100% on the brakes of the pulling locomotive itself. Now, let's piece the facts together. Bullard created the most powerful 060 locomotive in British history, up to 30,080 pounds of tractive effort, allowing it to haul munitions trains longer and heavier than any locomotive before it. Yet he equipped this Hercules with the scrawniest, flimsiest braking system possible, just so the design could hit the 14 tons lighter mark. Creating colossal power, but stripping away the ability to control that power, is no different from forging a heavy artillery cannon, but failing to build a recoil mount. When night fell, these Q1s had to drag heavily laden military trains hurtling down the steep, rugged inclines of southern England. Under the conditions of slippery tracks covered in winter frost, the train crews were literally shoved into a bloody game of Russian roulette. They blew the whistle, squeezing the brake levers to the point of exhaustion, but the massive inertial weight from behind ruthlessly pushed the entire machine skidding down the rails. The lives of the crew, and thousands of civilians living along the railway lines, were wagered on sheer luck rather than skill. Bullard's glamorous power-to-weight ratio specs were bought with absolute panic in the driver's cab. And if you think the braking system was the only thing slashed, this machine's maintenance records will make you shudder even more. Fans of the Q1 class often tell each other a seemingly humorous anecdote from the machine's final years. They pass around the story that drivers were often instructed to firmly close the regulator whenever steering a Q1 into a station platform. The given reason was to prevent ash and dust from the locomotive blowing straight into the faces of waiting passengers. Sounds incredibly thoughtful and somewhat amusing, doesn't it? But through the eyes of technical investigators, this is no funny story. It is the death knell of a machine decomposing itself. To force the Q1 into losing weight, Bullitt ordered the use of ultra-thin steel plates for the smoke box and boiler cladding. This was a fatal mistake. Under the pressure of extreme heat from the firebox and the ruthless corrosion of British weather, these weight-loss steel plates quickly became porous, rusted, and riddled with holes after only a short period of operation. The fact that toxic smoke and ash were violently sputtering out through the sides of the smoke box instead of shooting straight up the chimney was not a trivial flaw. It was the clearest evidence that the machine's structural shell had been torn apart, and the protective aerodynamic flow inside the boiler had collapsed. The locomotive was not operating smoothly at all. It was literally falling apart and cannibalizing its own body every time the fire was lit. The train crews didn't just have to face the terror of brake failure. They also had to breathe in a space flooded with leaking exhaust from a dilapidated machine. At this point, the grand mask of Oliver Bullitt begins to fall. Austerity design, it turns out, was not merely a sacrifice of aesthetics or materials. The greatest sacrifice here, tragically, was the lives, the safety of the railway workers, and the lifespan of the machine itself. All of it simply to serve the stubbornness and technical ego of a chief engineer desperate to prove himself amidst a time of war. At this point, a massive and highly paradoxical question will surely pop into your head. If the SRQ-1 was truly a death machine, an abysmal failure in safety and materials like what we've just dissected, then why weren't all 40 of these machines tossed into the scrapyard the moment World War II ended? Why did they survive intact, relentlessly plowing the British railways right up until July 1966? Conservative historians will immediately grab onto this 24-year lifespan figure like a life preserver to protect the legacy of Oliver Bullitt. They will loudly argue, "See? A terrible design could never operate durably for over 2 decades. Its lifespan is the very proof of its greatness." But, once again, historical truth is far more cruel than the praises. The continued existence of the Q1 class was not a hymn to engineering durability, but an elegy to the exhaustion of an empire. The truth about the Q1's 24-year lifespan did not stem at all from it being too wonderful a machine to be replaced, but because Britain, after 1945, was completely bankrupt. The empire on which the sun never sets had squeezed out its very last penny and torn apart its entire infrastructure for victory. When the railway companies were nationalized and merged into the British Railways network in 1948, the new management apparatus took over a desolate, decrepit system and an empty budget. They simply had no money to build safer replacement freight locomotives. Keeping the 40 Q1s was not a glorious choice. It was a bitter compromise of a nation buckling under the weight of reconstruction debt. And who were the ones forced to pay the price for that compromise? It was still the train crews. From 1943 right up to 1962, not a single Q1 was withdrawn. All 40 units were forced to remain in service. Throughout nearly 2 decades of peace, British railway workers still had to continue wrestling with these brakeless monsters. They still had to gamble their lives on the slopes, breathing in the toxic air sputtering from rusted smoke boxes that grew increasingly porous with time. Britain didn't throw the Q1 away. They chose to wring out its last ounce of strength and that of its operators until the machine rotted to a point beyond salvation. Mass withdrawals only truly began in 1963, and that was essentially the inevitable consequence of these machines cannibalizing their own bodies to an extremely dangerous degree, unable to be patched or repaired any longer. Looking back at the entire life cycle of the SRQ-1, we clearly see the true portrait of Chief Engineer Oliver Bulleid. Was he a genius or a madman? Perhaps he was both. The boundary between a nation-saving breakthrough and an engineering disaster is sometimes just as paper-thin as the rusted steel shell of this very machine. It cannot be denied that the Q1 dragged colossal munitions trains, contributing to helping Britain stand firm in its darkest hours. It fulfilled its historical mission, but the price in blood and tears paid for those beautiful specks has been deliberately whitewashed by wartime media and history. Today, if you have the chance to visit the National Railway Museum in York, you will see C1, numbered 33,001, the first built member and the sole surviving representative of the Q1 class, resting obediently under the glowing yellow lights. It wears its original pitch-black paint, the Southern Railway numbering painted in bright sunshine yellow. Thousands of tourists walk past it every day, marveling at its bizarre shape, looking up at the plaques that glorify it as a marvel of wartime austerity. But now, you know the truth. Behind that regal, glossy paint in the museum, C1 is not just a block of historical steel. It is a silent witness to an era where human lives were placed on the scales alongside the payload of metal. It reminds us of a bitter yet invaluable lesson. In the world of engineering and design, whenever you hear someone proudly declare that they have minimalized everything or slashed weight to achieve maximum power, beware. It is highly likely that the very thing they just quietly cut away was your safety. The investigation file on the ugly duckling SRQ-1 closes here. It is no longer simply a story debating the beauty or ugliness of a locomotive. It is an eternal warning about lies wrapped in the name of saving the nation and the true cost behind engineering legends.